Nobody really agrees on what caused the Opium Wars. Some say it was British greed. Others say it was China's stubborn refusal to modernize. And then there is this strange set of numbers. By the early 1800s, Britain was losing over 1.8 million silver taels a year to pay for Chinese tea. Yet in the same years, British merchants somehow made the Chinese empire dependent on a drug it never wanted, smuggling in thousands of chests of opium while pretending trade was free and fair. How can both things be true? How can a nation that had the world's largest bureaucracy, the strongest economy and centuries of stable rule suddenly collapse before a few European gunboats? And why did China, which once viewed Britain as barely worth mentioning, suddenly find itself fighting for its sovereignty? These contradictions don't make sense at first. And that is why the story of the Opium Wars is still confusing for many people even today. In this video, we're going to cut through that confusion and explore what was really happening behind the scenes: British ambitions, Chinese decisions, global trade pressures, and the political illusions on both sides. By the end, you will clearly see that the Opium Wars were not just about a drug. They were about money, pride, empire, and the clash between two completely different worldviews. To understand why the Opium Wars happened, we have to start with something almost never mentioned. Before Britain forced opium on China, it was actually Britain that desperately depended on China. Tea had become a national obsession in Britain, and tea only came from China. There was no British colony producing it, yet no India tea plantations, no Ceylon, nothing. So Britain had to buy directly from China, using silver because China didn't want anything Britain had to offer. No wool, no machines, no clocks, no textiles. China saw foreign goods as useless compared to its own industries. And the Qing Empire enforced a one-port system, allowing Western trade only through the southern port of Canton under strict rules. For China, this was a way to control foreigners. For Britain, it was humiliating and economically disastrous. The British East India Company was losing silver at a rate that scared London. Parliament debates from the early 1800s even reference this drain. One MP described China as a silver vacuum, pulling wealth out of the empire. So Britain needed something Chinese people would buy. Not want, buy. And that wasn't easy because China had been self-sufficient for thousands of years. Eventually, Britain found one product that could break China's economic defenses: opium. Grown in British-controlled Bengal, processed under British regulation, and smuggled into China by British merchants with full government knowledge. Officially, the British government always claimed it had nothing to do with the opium smuggling. But private letters, trading logs, and parliamentary inquiries from that era show that this was only a diplomatic cover. The operation was too large, too organized, and too profitable to be a private venture. By the 1830s, opium sales funded a huge portion of the East India Company's administration in India. Opium wasn't just a drug, it was an imperial business model. But while Britain used opium to fix its silver problem, China began drowning in addiction. Estimates vary, but even conservative records show millions were using opium regularly. Productivity dropped. Military officers were caught smoking. Officials were bribed to ignore the trade. The emperor received reports showing alarming amounts of silver flowing out of China, almost the exact mirror of what had been flowing out of Britain decades earlier. The Qing emperor wrote with growing frustration, "Foreigners poison our people, steal our silver, and defy our laws." And that leads to the single most important figure in this whole story: Lin Zexu, the imperial commissioner sent to end the opium trade once and for all. Lin Zexu is often remembered as a heroic Chinese official who took a moral stand. But what he really did was apply Qing law extremely efficiently. He shut down the opium dens, seized opium from warehouses, and arrested the Chinese middlemen helping British traders. Then he forced the British opium merchants themselves to surrender their inventory. In 1839, Lin Zexu publicly destroyed 20,000 chests of opium, worth hundreds of millions of dollars today. He sent a letter directly to Queen Victoria asking how Britain could justify selling a drug it banned at home. That letter was never answered. From the British perspective, Lin Zexu's crackdown wasn't seen as law enforcement. It was seen as an attack on British property, British merchants, and British prestige. Britain already believed that the Qing were arrogant, outdated, and uncooperative. Many British officials felt China needed to be opened to free trade by force if necessary. And here lies the hidden part of the story. For years before the war, many British politicians, especially Lord Palmerston, had been advocating a confrontation with China. Private letters and cabinet notes revealed that Palmerston believed China would eventually need to be taught a lesson to respect British commercial rights. So when Lin Zexu destroyed the opium, Palmerston finally had his excuse. Was this war really about protecting free trade? Or was Britain deliberately waiting for a trigger? It is hard to ignore the pattern. Britain had already used military force to pry open markets in other regions, like forcing open ports in Africa and the Middle East when local rulers resisted. China was simply a much bigger target. But was China really weak, as British newspapers claimed at the time? Not in the way people usually think. China was not militarily backward. The Qing army had millions of soldiers. China was not economically poor. It was one of the richest civilizations on Earth. The problem was different. China didn't understand Britain's style of global imperialism. And Britain didn't understand China's worldview. The Qing Empire had always seen itself as the center of the world. It believed foreign nations were tributaries, not equals. Even when dealing with European envoys, officials insisted on rituals symbolizing China's superiority. Britain, on the other hand, saw itself as the rising industrial superpower of the 1800s. It believed it had the right to trade anywhere. So both sides were operating on two completely separate mental maps of how the world worked. And this misunderstanding shaped everything. When the British demanded a reparations treaty, China saw it as barbaric extortion. When China insisted Britain follow its port rules, Britain saw it as an insult. When China seized opium as illegal contraband, Britain claimed its merchants' property rights were violated. Both sides believed they were morally correct. When war finally broke out, it wasn't a war between equal technologies. Britain brought steam-powered gunboats, precision cannons, naval artillery, and modern rifles. China fought with mostly older cannons, matchlock muskets, and traditional infantry formations. The result was predictable. British ships destroyed Chinese forts with almost casual efficiency. Many battles lasted minutes. Reports from the time described Qing soldiers firing outdated weapons that couldn't penetrate British ships' armor. Even worse, the Qing command was slow and divided. Regional armies refused to cooperate. Corruption crippled logistics. But this doesn't mean China was a weak civilization. It means China had not prepared for industrial warfare, and it had never imagined a European nation would attack over drug profits. By 1842, the Qing government was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of the so-called unequal treaties. Britain gained Hong Kong, forced China to open 5 treaty ports, demanded millions in silver reparations, and secured trading privileges that undermined Chinese sovereignty. China didn't just lose land, it lost control over its own economy. And this is where the confusion begins. Was this defeat caused by China's weakness or British aggression? Were the Opium Wars the inevitable clash between tradition and modernity? Or the result of a calculated imperial strategy? After the Treaty of Nanjing, many people in Europe believed the China problem was settled. Ports were opened, tariffs were lowered, and British merchants were finally free to trade without restrictions. But Britain was not satisfied. The treaty gave it access but not control. China still resisted fully accepting Western influence. It still refused to recognize foreign envoys as equals. It still attempted to regulate trade. From a British imperial viewpoint, this was unacceptable. London believed that if China did not completely integrate into the global economy on British terms, there would always be friction. And so, while newspapers in Britain claimed victory, British officials were already preparing the next steps. In contrast, within China, the treaty caused deep humiliation. Many officials felt that the Qing had been bullied into signing an agreement that violated the empire's dignity. Underground poetry, local reports, and secret memorials to the emperor reveal the same sentiment. We have been forced to kneel to barbarians. But instead of modernizing their military or changing their diplomatic approach, the Qing court convinced itself that this was only a temporary setback. Some advisors argued that Britain would soon lose interest. Others believed China should simply avoid provoking another conflict. This refusal to understand the scale of British ambition created a dangerous illusion, one that would collapse within a decade. The spark for the Second Opium War came from something almost trivial: the Arrow incident of 1856. A small Chinese police squad boarded a Chinese-owned ship that had once flown the British flag. British officials claimed the flag was still valid and that the boarding violated British sovereignty. China insisted the registration had expired and the ship was involved in piracy. In reality, the Arrow case was a technical, almost meaningless dispute. But for the British government, it was the perfect justification for a new war. Private letters between diplomats at the time make it clear they were waiting for any excuse to pressure China further. The Arrow incident was simply the pretext. This time Britain did not act alone. France joined, claiming to avenge the killing of a French missionary, another small incident magnified into a casus belli. The combined Anglo-French forces attacked Guangzhou, bombarded coastal defenses, and marched north toward Beijing. Unlike the First War, this conflict directly threatened the imperial court. The Qing military again struggled to respond. Some units were brave but outdated. Others never arrived because regional governors feared losing their own power. The emperor fled the capital as British and French troops approached. The invaders eventually burned the old summer palace. One of the most magnificent complexes in Chinese history, a cultural loss China still remembers deeply. The resulting Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Beijing forced China to legalize opium, open even more ports, accept foreign diplomats in Beijing, and give Western powers extensive rights. China was not merely defeated, it was reshaped. The Qing Empire entered what historians now call the Century of Humiliation, a period in which Western nations and Japan imposed deep political and economic controls. And here comes the key question. If the Opium Wars were simply about trade, why did Britain push so far? Why burn palaces, demand extraterritoriality, and insist on expanding rights endlessly? This is where the myth of Chinese weakness oversimplifies the truth. China was not inherently weak. It was strategically targeted at a moment when Britain was at the height of its industrial and naval power. Consider this. Britain had just defeated Napoleon, controlled India, dominated global sea routes, and was rapidly expanding into Africa and the Middle East. Its economy depended on constant market expansion. The British elite believed that free trade, enforced by military might, was the future of the world. If a nation resisted, Britain forced the issue. China happened to be the largest and wealthiest market, refusing to participate. That made it the biggest target. On the other side, China's weakness was not military incompetence, but worldview rigidity. The Qing Empire still believed the world should revolve around China. It maintained a tribute system while Europe was building industrial empires. It underestimated Western nations because it had not faced a major foreign threat in centuries. Diplomatic letters from the court show this clearly. Officials repeatedly described Britain as a small island country with limited importance. This misunderstanding was fatal. A civilization built on thousands of years of continuity simply could not adapt to the speed of 19th century geopolitics. So were the Opium Wars the result of British trade needs or Chinese weakness? The truth is that both interpretations contain pieces of reality, but neither tells the full story alone. Britain did want trade access, but not just access. It wanted dominance, profit, and geopolitical control. It needed markets to fuel industrial growth, and China's isolationist policies blocked that. Opium was the tool Britain used to force open the doors, a tool chosen deliberately because it was addictive, profitable, and hard for China to regulate. British trade records, parliamentary debates, and private correspondence all show a systematic strategy. Use opium to drain Chinese silver, use Chinese silver to buy Chinese goods, and use the resulting imbalance to break China's resistance. China, on the other hand, has often been portrayed as helpless or backward. But this is misleading. China was weak only in the sense that it was unprepared for industrial warfare and modern diplomacy. It was a giant moving slowly at a time when the world began moving fast. It was a society built on Confucian bureaucracy confronting a nation powered by steam engines and global capitalism. The two civilizations collided not because one was good and the other bad, but because they lived on different timelines. Britain lived in the 19th century. China still lived in the 18th. And when two timelines collide, the faster one always wins the first battle. But the Opium Wars did something neither side expected. For Britain, the victory brought profit but also long-term resentment from a nation that would eventually rise again. For China, the defeat forced the largest introspection in its history. Reformers began calling for Western learning, new armies, and industrialization. The shock of humiliation became the fuel for transformation. And in the long arc of history, China eventually overcame the damage. So were the Opium Wars caused by British trade ambitions or by Chinese weakness? The truth is that they were caused by a deliberate economic strategy, a clash of worldviews, and the brutal logic of empire building. Trade was the excuse. Opium was the tool. Power was the real motive. And perhaps the most revealing fact of all is that even after all the treaties, after all the forced concessions, after decades of dominance, a century later, Britain lost its empire while China returned as a major world power. The Opium Wars were not the end of China. They were the beginning of a transformation whose consequences still shape global politics today.